Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 85 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on Max, sitting alone in his well-appointed living room. He has a glass of wine in his hand, an open bottle nearby. He's carefully building a fragile pyramid of playing cards. From the hall beyond, the front door is heard being opened with a key. Max does not react. The door slams, not violently, but just enough so that the pyramid of cards collapses. Max looks philosophically at the cards and, not moving, drinks from his wine glass. His wife, Charlotte, enters breezily. She has apparently been on a work trip to Switzerland and has brought Max a souvenir gift, a snow globe of the Alps. Except that Charlotte has not been to Switzerland because Max has found her passport in the recipe drawer. This is the opening of Tom Stoppard's clever and romantic exploration of love and literature, The Real Thing, which was first performed at the Strand Theatre in London in November 1982, with a cast headed by Roger Rees and Felicity Kendall. In 1982, Stoppard had been writing plays for more than 15 years, starting with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, with its fairy tale breakthrough at the Edinburgh Festival in 1966. He was renowned for his intellectual wit and playful dramatic form, which is certainly on show in this new play. But The Real Thing also explores more personal, emotional territory, on what constitutes the real thing in love and art. As the critic Michael Billington said on including it in his 101 Greatest Plays, that of all of Stoppard's plays, The Real Thing strikes me as most durable in its ability to combine emotional depth with structural intricacy. As we record this episode, a new production of the play is on stage at the Old Vic Theatre in London. Having seen and loved The Real Thing when it premiered all those years ago, I'm excited to have the chance to revisit the play. My guest today, to help us navigate the play's romantic entanglements and structural twists, is the renowned arts journalist Mark Lawson. Mark is a journalist, broadcaster, author, and playwright. He is a cultural critic and feature writer for The Guardian, writes regularly about TV for Radio Times, and is theatre critic of The Tablet. His work as a broadcaster includes Mark Lawson Talks To on BBC 4, Front Row on Radio 4, and Late Review, Newsnight Review on BBC 2. He has also written TV drama, at least 5 novels, and more than 24 radio plays for the BBC. Welcome to the Play Podcast, Mark. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Doug. It's a great pleasure.
So when we met a while back and we're talking about the possibility of your coming on the podcast, I asked you what plays or playwrights you'd be most interested in talking about. And Tom Stoppard's name was high on your list, I believe. I also happened to notice that Hermione Lee recorded a personal thank you to you in her majestic biography of Stoppard, in which he described you as a rich fund of knowledge on Tom Stoppard and his work. So, first off, I want to ask you, when did you first encounter Stoppard's work, and particularly this play, and what is it about it that made such an impression on you?
Well, we'll get to this play in a moment. I was introduced to Stoppard extraordinarily at the age of 7 when my parents took my twin sister and I to see Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead.
No kidding.
Yeah, as a 7th birthday present. Now, there are people who would say that they should have been locked up or reported to the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty for Children. I disagree. What's interesting, and I've talked to lots of people who were taken to it as children, actually, nobody who saw it at that age ever forgets the coins at the beginning. For people who don't know Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, they're tossing coins to pass the time, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, who are the attendant lords in Hamlet. And it comes down heads 85 times. And now this obviously statistically, it's not impossible, but it's improbable. But I still remember the thrill of those coins. It's really funny to a child. I didn't know what Hamlet was at that point, but I do remember the actor walking back and forth with the book. And even then, I understood the joke, I think, that these people were caught up in something that they couldn't actually resolve. So that was my introduction to Stoppard. I'm deeply grateful to them.
Yes, I think you should be. That's a great introduction to theater.
Yeah.
I was taken to see Hamlet when I was 10, I think.
Well, there you go. So later on, my mother, if I'd been reasonably good, she used to say, we'll go to the local bookshop and, you can choose 3 books. And I was there one day, when I was 11, and I saw the front of the Faber edition of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. And I thought, it's that play. So I bought that play on that day. And then after that, I then bought Jumpers. And then over the years, I got travesties. So I began to follow him. Then I went to University College London. We'll get to the fact that it's not a great date play, the real thing. But I actually went on a date to it with my girlfriend at the time. We went to see a late preview of the real thing. And also, that was the first time I'd physically seen Tom Stoppard, because he strode down the aisle with his shoulder bag with huge numbers of packets of cigarettes sticking out of it.
And no doubt still scribbling changes to the script.
Oh, yeah, no, we'll get on to that, because it's really changed. I think that's the first published one, and then that's the second published one.
For those listening, he's holding up different versions of the play text. I have all those.
I have all of these, and then the one that's been used as the basis for new production is the 1986 text, which is from Tom Stoppard Plays 5.
Not that you're obsessed or anything.
No, but then I became a journalist and broadcaster, and I was lucky enough to interview Tom Stoppard numerous times. All his early plays really are based around another play, with the exception possibly of Jumpers. And that does get us to the real thing, really, because there are fewer Stoppard plays that don't have another text behind them than those that do.
And this has references to some other texts, which I think we'll talk about.
Well, it has a huge number of them, actually.
I was going to say that the real thing has a very personal place in my theater life as well, because I did also see the original production back in 1982. And it was at a time when I had just had my heart broken for the first and really only time, but very badly broken. And it was by an actress. So this play touched a very sore nerve for me at the time, I have to say. I absolutely loved it. It was the stylishness of the performances. It was the effortlessly clever structure, wonderfully romantic take on writing, which I fall for every time. But I was mainly in bits about the love stories gone wrong.
So, Doug, I'd been luckier than you at that point, because I do remember, and obviously life catches up with you afterwards, that my girlfriend and I, we were quite bemused by the line in the play that is still there in the production now, that love isn't loving someone at their best, it's loving them at their worst.
Yes.
And we hadn't actually done the worst. So we thought, oh, God, this is a bit gloomy about the whole thing.
I did the worst. Yeah, and we're going to talk about the worst behavior. So actually, let's start with where the play comes from in Stoppard's career. You mentioned several of these other earlier plays and the fact that they featured plays within plays and playful theatrical form. I mean, that's on show here, but how do you say this play fits into that? I mean, it's an exception in some ways, although I believe you don't agree with the idea that this is the first play where he writes with true emotion, for example, as many would say.
Yeah, as many do say, and I often disagree with them. One of the startling things about it, which I was shocked when I realized it, and some people will query it, but I'm going to sustain this argument. It was his 6th major play, if you include Every Good Boy Deserves Favor, which I do. And it was the first set in contemporary England. And I've always thought, I don't think enough attention has been paid to this.
Doesn't that speak to it being more personal, potentially, then?
Yeah, more personal, but I think that he hadn't wanted to be that kind of writer. I mean, there's a lot of self-reference in the play. There's one which he has admitted, the line about he can't write love because he looks at a whole page and thinks there's no writing. That is him. I think he was also nervous of writing about contemporary England. He was also nervous of writing about the theatre. Sir Henry, the protagonist, is a playwright. Stoppard very much, he has said, did not want him to be one because he thought, oh, everyone will say that's him.
He also said, I thought it might indicate that one had run out of everything if one started to write plays about people writing plays.
Yeah, no, exactly. He was worried about that, but then the extraordinary and still stunning to me structure of it made it necessary for him to be a playwright. Because, should we do the setup here?
Yeah, go on then. So for listeners who don't know the play and may not get a chance to see the current production here in London, we're going to give you a brief summary of what happens in the plot. And I'm going to issue my usual warning about spoilers at this stage. So if you're going to still see the show in London, you might like to turn off now and come back later and listen afterwards. But otherwise, we're going to plow on. So I set up the opening of the play at the top with Charlotte not going to Switzerland, as she told her husband Max. But that is not, in fact, the beginning of a play about adultery that we're about to witness, or at least it's not their play. Anyway, perhaps you could explain what that all means.
I can. So this is a real plot spoiler, and I remember, as you will, the shock during the second scene. So we see these two characters in the opening scene, as you say. We don't actually know what they're called, I think, for the simple reason that they have two names, as it were. Max and Charlotte, we see playing this rather brittle West End marital comedy. And older critics are quite open that at this point they had written off Stoppard. They thought he'd lost it because that isn't what he writes.
This is not a very good play we're watching.
No, well, exactly. But that's where he's so clever and indeed daring that we are not watching, for one of maybe 24 times in this play, we are not watching the real thing. We're watching a West End marital comedy called House of Cards. So that's what we've been watching, the opening scene of that. And it's a real shock because in the second scene, the adulterous wife from the first scene is now married to Henry,
the playwright who's written the scene of the first play.
Yes, although we didn't realize this for some time. And you are, I think, supposed to think that they've split up the couple from the first scene and they've got together with somebody else. Actually, they haven't. It's much more complicated. And then, and I don't understand people who said that it was his simplest play ever, Max, the actor we've seen in the opening scene, he then turns up with another woman who is called Annie, and she is an actress.
So the point is that the first two characters we see on the first scene are the actors, and then we see them in so-called real life.
Yeah, Stoppard is very grumpy about having had to put in more lines to explain this, because a lot of people still didn't understand what had happened. They thought they were simply watching a failed marriage followed by another marriage.
Henry's written the play. Max, who was acting in the play in the first scene, is really married to Annie.
Yeah, although not for much longer, because
no.
And this is another plot spoiler, and it's always a shock in any production. It's clear that Henry and Charlotte are not happily married, the playwright and the actress. And then Henry and Annie are left alone in the room, and she says, "Go on, kiss me."
Says, "Touch me."
She says more, actually. She says, "Touch me, do it to me on the carpet now." They either come in or they don't come in. Daring stuff. And not to be recommended for anyone in any relationship. And then it gets more and more complicated.
See, I knew this wasn't going to be easy, because this is pretty intricate, the plotting of this thing.
This is very intricate. It then gets more and more intricate in that, I think, every scene there is a reference to some other text. Sometimes very oblique. So the adultery is revealed by a handkerchief that is found in a car. And Stoppard has said that he originally wrote Henry as a black playwright and he was going to do Othello.
Wow. Okay.
So the real thing began very early on as a version of Othello, and the handkerchief is the last remnant of that. But then also Le Ronde is there, just in those opening scenes, quite obliquely, but I think deliberately, because he's very interested in Schnitzler's
merry-go-round of adulterous relationships.
Yeah, which to me, I think is him dealing with his issue of writing about love. So people express love through scenes from Strindberg's Miss Julie, Ford's "'Tis Pity She's a Whore," a daring choice, and then also, which is the most, to some people, controversial one, a prisoner called Brodie, who went to jail for burning a wreath on the cenotaph. He has written an angry script about what happened to him. And remarkably, I think we get 5 different versions of that script, played with a different meaning each time, which is an extraordinary thing. So Henry eventually rewrites Brodie's script. But what I hadn't realized until the most recent production, I looked at the text again, is he rewrites it to be about him and Annie, whereas it's supposed to be about Brodie and Annie. And so people say, look, it's Stoppard going simple and straight. He really isn't.
No, I mean, I don't know whether that was about as clear as mud.
Yeah.
It's really difficult to précis the comings and goings and the relationships on display.
Except the simple thing to say is that at almost every moment, you are being asked the title question, is this the real thing?
Yes.
Is this a real relationship? Is this real love? Is this a real scene within the confines of the play, or is it a scene from another play, which it often is? So I think once you get into that, it becomes fantastically enjoyable.
And when they're scenes from other plays, they could also be, of course, in the words they're using, expressing their true feelings.
Which is why it's so extraordinary. So Annie and Billy, a young actor who falls in love with her, they are appearing in "'Tis Pity She's a Whore," and they play that scene, I think, 3 times. On one occasion, they're falling in love as they rehearse the lines. On another occasion, which again is the subtlety of this, it's clear that they're splitting up, that she doesn't want this relationship. And that all comes out through the lines of this other play. I mean, it's just, I think it's a remarkable piece of writing.
You know what? I imagined whether Stoppard had to draw up a chart showing all of the connections because, I mean, it's a challenge, but it's also one of the great joys of the play is the way we track the interconnected, revolving relationships, the multiple doubling of pairings, real and fictional. Hermione Lee describes it as a hall of mirrors, these reflections of couples in love and breaking up, or like a series, I suppose, of Russian dolls, one inside the other with these different plays within which scenes are enacted. It is structurally so playful, but also quite resonant. It adds, I think, a richness to the play and certainly a thematic richness in the sense of what is the real thing as love is presented in art or for real, and the differences between those renditions of what love is. And also, I think it somehow suggests how fragile love can be and the risks thereof and how repetitive all these stories are as old as time that people just keep going through these scenarios of falling in and out of love and betraying each other.
I think all of that, but if we may, of the young, heartbroken Doug watching this.
Oh my God.
No, but you see, that's the fascinating thing. So you are watching a fiction, and yet that fiction reads in, as it does for all of us, into our own relationships.
Yeah. It's interesting you said that there's this wonderful irony, isn't there? That Henry, in Stoppard's voice, I guess, says, I don't know how to write about love. And then the whole play is bloody good at doing just that, at writing about love, at describing both the sublime moments and the gut-wrenching pain of when it goes wrong. He starts off with Henry saying, loving and being loved is unliterary. It's happiness expressed in banality and lust. It just comes out embarrassing. I guess that's the common idea that happiness doesn't necessarily inspire great art. It's the pain. Happiness is boring, whereas heartbreak often does. But actually, I think Henry describes the all-consuming joy of love beautifully.
I think so, but it's interesting, though, that he's always doing it behind some kind of mask or other text. I agree that he does do it brilliantly. Henry's daughter, Debbie, very unusually, Debbie is only in one scene. The West End producer, Michael Codron, said, look, can we lose the daughter? And you can't lose the daughter because there are 2 key things that she says, and they're self-references. So she hasn't liked House of Cards that her father wrote and her mother was in. And she says it wasn't about anything. And he says it was about self-knowledge through pain. And she says, no, it wasn't. It was about, did she have it off or did she? And in the final scene, we realize that the real thing is about self-knowledge through pain, because that's what happens to Henry.
Exactly. Also, it's sort of self-referential, isn't it, in terms of that reputation of House of Cards of being a lightweight, clever, superficial thing, which, he himself perhaps has been accused of. So he's brave enough to lay that out there.
It was his second play to open directly into the West End. And there was a bit of muttering that, the plays were getting lighter and softer. I think we've established that this one doesn't. But then Debbie, the daughter, has another key line where Henry says, I still remember the moment when I realized that the universe was reducible to one person.
Yes.
And she says, and this is a crucial line, she says, don't write it fast, say it the first time you fell in love. Now, that again is another astonishing self-reference because it's Stoppard saying, this is the way I would have written about love before, and I'm just going to write about it directly now.
Yes, and I don't think Henry does hide behind. He expresses it himself, the feelings about falling in love, doesn't he? There's some great, great speeches.
Oh, you see, we're going to differ on this, Doug. I think that the self-knowledge through pain is that Henry is a hopeless romantic,
Yes,
but a performative romantic, I think. He hasn't had his heart broken until the final scenes.
that's true.
And that's when he really discovers what love is.
But then things that he says earlier still ring true to me. Like, I love love. I love having a lover and being one. The insularity of passion. I love it. I love the way it blurs the distinction between everyone who isn't one's lover. Only two kinds of presences in the world, there's you and there's them. I mean, it captures the myopic, obsessive quality of it.
I know, but then when does he say that, though? Because I think that's on his journey to realization, isn't it?
All these descriptions he have is about that singularity of it, where you just feel like you're in your own world, and the way that they know each other, and the difference between private and public selves that he describes so well as well.
Yes. You see, again, I also disagree in that I think, you see, it's also possible, certainly as he's played by James McArdle in the current Old Vic production, that Henry is a bit of a narcissist.
Oh, definitely.
So all that stuff about the insularity of it, I'm not sure that's great. I think he has to learn that there are two people in a relationship.
Correct.
And I think he hasn't learned that. So that's why I question the power of those opening speeches, because I think they're supposed to show to me that he is not very good at love.
Okay.
There's a later line where he says, I feel I left a door open. We know these people. There are people in their 60s or 70s even who've never had their heart broken because they've always had relationships on their own terms and they've always got out of them first. Now, I think Henry is one of those people. And I think it's crucial that he is left. We see him first as the leaver, and then we see him being left by Annie. And a lot of women severely dislike the character of Annie, but I think there is a defense of her.
I do agree with you that there's an element of his triumphalism in the first half of the play before his heart is broken.
Yeah.
And he feels superior and utterly confident in his views of everything, including love. Though I do think that what he says about it is accurate. And I think Stoppard's very good on sexual attraction in the play. That moment we talked about, the first scene when Annie and Henry are first left alone and she says, touch me. It's electrifying, the erotic charge there and the danger of it you mentioned. And the references to Miss Julie, 'tis pity she's a whore. And then Henry has this great speech about temptation, sexual temptation, or the temptation to adultery. So even while he's happy in his relationship, he says, I don't want anyone else. But sometimes, surprisingly, there's someone, a small quickening. The room responds slightly to being entered. Nothing intended, and a long way from doing anything. But you catch the glint of being someone else's possibility. And it's a sort of politeness to show you haven't missed it. So you push it a little, well within safety. But there's that sense of promise. And one more push would do it. It's brilliant. It's an incremental thing and how opportunity may present it. And then you end up making the mistake potentially.
Yes, I do think we're agreeing on this, but you see, when he makes that speech, to me, he's describing how he left Charlotte for Annie, but he's also understanding because at the end of that speech, he says Billy, a reference to this young actor.
Yes. And then it's about how Annie leaves as well.
Yeah. So he's realized that. Now, I just want to address here the thing about this was the play 15 years into his career in which brainy Tom finally shows his heart. Absolute rubbish in my view.
Is it just the subject matter of this play being, as he says, he did want to write about love? And it seems to me that there must have been personal inspiration. It feels very direct, and the anguish of the heartbreak is deeply felt.
But we have to be really careful about this because Felicity Kendall was in the first production of The Real Thing. And this has led to the canard that it's about their relationship. Stoppard pointed out that the book is dedicated to Miriam, to whom he was then married and apparently happily married. I think everyone agrees at that point.
So his relationship with Felicity Kendall post-dated the play, isn't that right?
Post-dated the play, yeah, by some years. Now, you can argue that at some level he possibly was writing about her because he chose her to be in the play. The other thing I'd say about this is that, and it's why it works so well, because people keep quoting great lines about love to each other. I talked to an actor who was married 5 or 6 times, as many actors are, and indeed theatre directors. And he said, I would challenge anyone, if you had a job that involved pretending to fall in love, kiss, and have sex with people, you probably would not have been married once. And that seems to me entirely fair. But it is crucial to this play because it's why it works so brilliantly. Because they have to convince us as an audience that they're falling in love. But is it the real thing? Yes, sometimes it is.
Yes. And is there a line in the play about, at the very end, in fact, about actors and actresses and how that might not be the most reliable choice of partner?
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. The temptations are just put in your way repeatedly.
The more you can convince an audience that you are in love with this person, the more likely you are to get more work and an Olivier Award. There is allegedly a production of The Real Thing in which members of the cast started falling in love and leaving their partners. It is, again, why it's an astonishing play, because it's kind of tripwired for that to happen, I think.
As well as the sublime elements of love, which you slightly countermanded, the heartbreak is real, isn't it? The mess and pain that he experiences. As we said earlier, we have Max initially being betrayed. And in the first scene, it's all very witty and poised. And then Max in real life, Annie leaves him, and he is a mess. He's pathetically bereft. He's blubbering, hanging onto her legs, begging her not to leave. And then the same thing happens to Henry. So very cleverly, we have 3 different versions of the same cuckolded husband scene, in essence, and how they behave. And Henry, having had all this suave confidence, is also devastated. And dignity goes out the window, so to speak. He humiliates himself. And he says, I don't believe in behaving well. I believe in mess, tears, pain, self-abasement, loss of respect, nakedness. We talked earlier about, behaving badly. And actually, I've linked back to that heartbreak. I felt sick and numb with fear and grief. I had this kind of frenzied desolation that I could almost not function, frankly. I mean, I was very young.
Oh, and everyone's been there, yeah. It happens to Henry crucially. You think we're disagreeing more than I think we are, in that I think all we're disagreeing on, possibly, is the arc of Henry. So there's another self-reference in the play where Stoppard says, I can't bear to look at half a page without any writing on it. And so the key moment for me is where Henry, after Annie appears to be leaving him and has certainly left him emotionally and possibly sexually, although that's ambiguous, Henry has the line, oh, please, please, please don't. Now, I think neither Henry nor Stoppard could imagine ever having got to the point of that line. I think it's a huge breakthrough for both of them, because that isn't fancy writing, that is raw emotion. And it's one of the reasons I think it's a great play, is that it gets to that point where the suave, witty, he's got a gag reflex, he says earlier, he's always looking for the joke, and it's gone at that point. But then also, as you say, we do see the same scene 3 times, effectively, of the partner leaving. If done properly, that scene gets more and more real.
Yes, correct.
So the second time it's realer than the first time, and then it's not an expression really real, but by the third time, it is really real. And that ties into the theme of the play.
You're absolutely right. And it is so gut-wrenching and honest, I think. When he says things like, I'm supposed to score points for dignity, I don't think I can. It'll become my only thought. It'll replace thinking. That's brilliant in terms of how all-consuming this pain becomes. And also how he portrays the terrible thing, how you become pathetic, someone your lover won't respect. So it becomes a self-fulfilling spiral. Your self-pity or neediness makes everything worse. And Annie says this to him, you have to find a part of yourself where I'm not important or you won't be worth loving. And, he understands it. When I got pathetic, I could feel how tedious it was, how unattractive. Dignified cuckoldry is a difficult trick. That's a pretty neat phrase, but he basically shows us how difficult it is.
Yeah. But this might be a good point to get to the character of Annie, which has been very controversial
Yes.
because it's quoted in Hermione Lee's magnificent biography, and I think Felicity Kendall says it, and many women who've played Annie have said this, that it's a hard role to play because the audience doesn't like you. I find that fascinating. And again, I think it's why Stoppard is such a clever and generous playwright. So, little bit of history that's always fascinated me. Between 1978 and 1982, three plays by major British playwrights of around the same generation are written, all about adultery, which are Harold Pinter's Betrayal, Peter Nichols' Passion Play, or Passion as it's known in North America, and Tom Stoppard's The Real Thing. Now, in each case, they are among the most revived of the playwright's work. Now, that's not surprising in that unless you've been very lucky or unlucky, and people argue it either way, you will have some experience of relationships going wrong. So in Peter Nichols' play, it's the husband who commits adultery, and that's by far the most common literary presentation of infidelity, because many people argue it was the most common social presentation. What I think Stoppard does particularly, and I think Pinter is also touching at in Betrayal, is the character of Nora in A Doll's House by Henry Gibson, who does leave. And there are lots of doors slamming in this play. When a woman leaves the stage, a door tends to slam. Stoppard is far too clever not to know what he's doing. And it's a reference to Nora. But the problem with the actresses have identified with playing Annie, and it's something that Ibsen was writing about all that time ago, is that people still think it's somehow less acceptable for a woman to behave like that.
I was going to say this to you because I did pick up on this very point. Felicity Kendall saying it was difficult to gain the sympathy of the audience because Annie is very blatant about what she needs and feels, she said.
Yeah.
And, you know, in a way, I found that a bit dated now, that sense of that. I don't think we would feel that way so much now. Well, I don't.
No, we're agreeing. I think you're right. I think that it's a proto-feminist play in that way. And it's proto-feminist via A Doll's House, which was itself really proto-feminist. So, yes, I think that's less of a problem now.
Yes. But one of the things that is challenging is that she does insist on her agency to continue to have whatever she wants with Billy. And that can be surprising.
Yeah, yeah. It can, but I think you're right, though, Doug. It's less surprising now.
There's, again, a great repetition goes on, another doubling where we talked about the temptation that Henry identified. And then Annie actually describes how Billy got under her radar. And the next thing, you know, I'm looking around for him, makes the day feel better. It's love or something. No, it is love. Absolutely. How can I say it wasn't? So again, that isn't downplayed either, I think. And she sticks to her guns in a sense until she gets to a point where she decides or realizes it isn't the real thing. It means less than I thought. She has been flattered by it. She's the older woman. He's not mature enough for her, I guess. And I thought that also rang true, that, you know, you can go through that quite quickly, potentially, in a relationship.
Absolutely. So the tip I gave to confused listeners or people going to see this play, just keep that question at all times in your head. Is this the real thing? Because, and again, this is one of the, I think, complexities of it. Annie is tempted into another relationship, I think, because she comes to think, well, this isn't the real thing with Henry.
Yes, there's a suggestion about why does she do that. I think it is an interesting question because apparently they should be in good form, this relationship, Henry and Annie. I also think that they've been through the mess of an affair and split up already. They must be more aware of the dangers thereof. And yet she still embarks on that. What is the reason she does that? Well, there's a suggestion that he's been somehow inattentive or too complacent.
Yeah.
And he says, as you mentioned earlier, I think, that it's though I've been careless, left the door open somewhere while preoccupied. And she feels like he hasn't been as attuned as he should be, hasn't been jealous enough, ironically, for example. And he defends this by going, I'm a romantic.
Yes.
I don't feel the need for jealousy. I'm so confident of our relationship that I don't need to play that jealous part.
I think this is fascinating, you see. So I think we're told a number of things that have happened, as often happens to couples who leave a partner and then get together. It can be the real thing sexually and romantically, but there are the complications. He's writing this hideous sci-fi script that we get an extract from to pay the alimony for his ex-wife and his daughter. Also, he has promised Annie that he'll write a play for her, and he hasn't, which is another of her resentments.
But that could be back to my point about how writing positively about love is very hard. Heartbreak's easier as a subject.
Yeah. Then also, in another of the dizzying complexities of this, Henry is jealous of Brodie. To explain to people, Brodie is the anti-war protester prisoner. Annie is on the committee to try to get him released. Henry is openly jealous of that. He thinks that, he even says it, that Annie fancies Brodie. But in this astonishing, as Hermione Lee said, Hall of Mirrors, his problem isn't Brodie, it's the actor playing Brodie.
Yes, exactly.
In the script that he has written. So she does have an affair with Brodie, but it's not with Brodie.
No. Yeah. Well, and also Brodie, of course, represents another theme in the play, which is about what the real thing is in writing.
Well, and also politics.
And politics. So let's start with writing. Firstly, we talked earlier about the fact this is a playwright who's written comic plays. And so the immediate assumption is that Henry is Stoppard, and he has said there's a lot of me in it. It's intellectually autobiographical, he said. It was perfectly obvious that when Henry was waving his prejudices around, he was pretty much speaking for me. And particularly some of the notions I have about writing, Stoppard said. So one of the themes is, which, as you mentioned, Brodie, who's put in prison because of his protest, writes a very crude agitprop play with a political purpose in mind. And Annie wants it to get made. It's very poorly written, so she would like Henry's help in tarting it up. But this just raises this question about what makes good writing. Can good writing be political?
Yeah.
Is writing have to have something to say, or is it just about saying something well? And it's a very one-sided debate, really, because Henry, on the side of good writing, gets all the great lines. But, you know, there are some qualifications. There are some counter-arguments go on. He talked about the fact that he's writing this terrible sci-fi film script, and also that House of Cards itself isn't really deemed to be that great a piece. I mean, his daughter says, oh, it's infidelity among the architect class again.
Again, yeah.
But it is pretty loaded, isn't it, this debate?
Well, now, okay, I'm going to defend him because he was always regarded as the outlier among English playwrights of his generation because he was seen to be right wing. Now, I think that's complicated. You know, he came from communist Czechoslovakia, as it then was. I mean, you would have certain number of views about that. He was surrounded by playwrights, some of whom were actual Marxists. I think it would be very hard, given his background, not to be apart from that.
I think he has said he's conservative by nature. I think he used a word like that.
Yeah, I think we're conservative with a small c. I think this is an unusual play, and the plays normally date. It's just an inevitability. We talked about how in Annie, that woman who just wants agency and wants to behave as she wants to is now a much more acceptable thing than it was when he wrote it. I think also the debate about authenticity is central now in theatre. So what they're saying is Rode is a great playwright because he's lived this. This is real. It's another thing about it's authentic. And Henry's argument is that you don't have to have lived it. It doesn't have to have authentic anger or whatever. It just needs to be effective. And he has a famous speech about a cricket bat.
And he uses that metaphor. And I want to come to that. I mean, you're right about authenticity. And there is a question raised attacking Henry going, it's all very well that you can write well, but you always have to think up something to write about.
Yeah.
And also there's a quite persuasive argument about the conventional expectations of what constitutes good writing. You teach a lot of people what to expect from good writing. You end up with a lot of people saying you write well. You judge everyone as though everyone starts off in the same place, aiming at the same prize, lit. Shakespeare out in front by a mile and the rest of the field strung out behind, trying to close the gap. Still, that speech about the cricket bat, he knocks it out of the park at that moment, doesn't he? You can't argue with the brilliance of the way he puts the words together, drawing the metaphor. It's beautifully constructed. It's a mesmerizing moment in the actor's mouth and in the theater. And in doing so, it almost proves its point. I mean, it's impossible not to be completely swayed. As romantic as
Yeah.
it is unbelievably effective, that speech.
And it's beautifully done by McArdle, but it was seen at the time as an essentially right-wing argument. I think this is now much more complicated, and the left and the right have come together on certain things, separated on others. But the fundamental argument where he waves his cricket bat, this isn't better because someone says it's better, or because there's a conspiracy by the MCC to keep cudgels out of Lords, but crucially, it's better because it's better. Now, that is a really radical argument now. Academia is engulfed by this argument at the moment. Why do you teach all this stuff? Because who decided it was better? So again, it's very timely in that way.
Is it not better because it's better? His speech is much better than the dialogue that we hear Brodie's written in his play.
Yeah, but I say it's a very unpopular argument now. I think also, yet another complexity in this play is that unusually in a Stoppard play, I think we are invited to think what happens to the characters next.
Okay. I mean, I would like to talk about the ending at some point.
Yeah, let's do that then, because I've got a theory about the ending.
Okay. While we're still on the topic of writing, however, and language, there is an interesting point about the importance of accuracy in the use of language, which is beyond Henry's amusing tendency of pedantically correcting grammar, much as that pains him, and I enjoy those bits. Underlying that is the importance of accuracy, is the idea that we're adhering to agreed rules of use and meaning. And if we ignore those, then distorting language becomes a distortion of truth. Fake news, if you will. He talks about words as being innocent and describes the effect that they can have if you get the right ones in the right order. You can nudge the world a little.
Yeah.
It's a romantic idea in some way about the power of writing. But underlying that, I thought there was something intriguing about truth as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely there. And I think for Stoppard, because Stoppard came from Eastern Europe, I think Orwell is a very important writer to him without necessarily being stated. In a number of Stoppard plays, languages are invented and taught to the audience. So all that stuff is there about changing words so that they mean the opposite, which certainly goes back to Orwell.
So yes, because he talks about someone else will say something very persuasive and he thinks, wow, that's nonsense, however. Sophistry in a phrase so neat you can't see the loose end that would unravel it.
Yeah.
While words are innocent, they can also be manipulated.
Well, no, because there are so many examples, and I do think it's fundamentally there, and I think it's in his political background. I think he's always thought this, that words do have meanings. And I don't know if you want to mention former and perhaps future President Trump at this point, but I mean, he has done something extraordinary to the language in which a word can have exactly the opposite meaning. The Justice Party in Poland, which was pointed out, had almost no interest in justice whatsoever. I'm sure would have amused Stoppard. On the pedantry, this might amuse you. I was waiting outside Broadcasting House in London to meet him for one of the interviews we were doing. And I noticed that he crossed Regent Street twice. He was on one side and then he went to the other and then he came back. And I said, oh, I was interested. I said, did you get lost? Because I noticed you crossed the road. And he said, oh, no, no, no. He said, no. He said, no, I'm sorry. I'm just so pathetic. He said, there's a company called French Connection, and they advertise themselves with FC UK. And it infuriated Tom Stoppard so much that every time he sees the word FC UK, he crossed the road. So he didn't have to walk past it.
Well, he does say that Henry, it really hurts him when they get it wrong.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned it, because I think that's one of the most revealing stories about Stoppard. And he does give all that pedantry to Henry, but at the root of it also is that words like justice, they have meanings, and you don't mess with them. So, although one critic did say this play has dated, its ideas have not dated at all. They've become, if anything, more current, because, now, I mean, clearly he wasn't thinking of AI when he wrote it. But now when we see a politician making a speech, we literally don't know if it's the real thing. So I think as a general metaphor for love politics, and as I say, just keep thinking while watching it, is this the real thing?
I was going to ask you about music.
Oh, yeah.
You could argue there's a certain snobbishness in Henry's attitude to what makes good writing, and yet he's brave enough in the play to actually counter that in his taste of music. We haven't mentioned that one of the elements in the plot is that Henry is about to appear on a radio program called Desert Island Discs. For those who are not in the UK and may not be familiar, it's where you choose 8 records, your favorites of all time. And the reasons that you choose these records can vary. And then in Henry's case, he understands that it's an opportunity to construct a public image of himself by the choices he makes. So he's looking for classical music to show that he's a cultured individual. And yet, what he really loves is pop music, and not just serious or pretentious pop music like Pink Floyd or whatever, but really sentimental singles.
Yeah.
And how does he reconcile that he's the serious playwright and has these views about what makes good writing, but actually falls for pop tunes?
Yes, because I don't know if you've done a Noel Coward play, but one of Noel Coward's most famous lines, I think it's from Private Lives, isn't it? It's funny how potent cheap music is.
I had that line written down here.
There you go. That's another of the plays lying behind this one. So in an extreme case, if you happen to hear the Chicken song shortly after you fell in love or after one of your parents had died, it would always have that association. Should you really be going to tragic opera for that kind of reaction? But then Henry has done that, and it doesn't have any impact on him whatsoever. And in the productions, which is another thing, it plays it on the audience. So if you're skeptical about this, if you go into this play thinking, oh, opera is automatically more powerful on the subject of death and love than pop music, when you hear "You've Lost That Loving Feeling" or "I'm a Believer,"
or "I'm Into Something Good," Herman Hermits, they're absolutely irresistible.
They are. Now, you've got to be really snobbish or stubborn. And it's another thing, extraordinary. I mean, who would think that little snatches of music between the scenes would also ask you that question? Is this a real thing?
Yeah, and they're all wonderful titles, appropriate to what's going on. You've lost that loving feeling. I'm into something good. I'm a believer at the end. Brilliant shorthand, but also unbelievably catchy. Yeah. Is Stoppard's play Mozart or the Monkees? I think it's probably both, and they're both great.
Yeah, but it is true, as he says in terms in the play, some of those 3-minute pop songs encapsulate life and emotion at an extraordinary level.
Yeah, and they hit you right there.
Yeah.
Let's go to the ending. You wanted to say something about the ending. We talked a bit about the debate about writing that goes on earlier, and the moral dice are even more than a little loaded in the debate at the end, because Brody himself turns up and behaves like a complete boor, which is, I think, it's a bit unfair in terms of tipping the moral argument. But there we go. We also have Max telephoning to announce that he's going to remarry. So the merry-go-round of relationship goes on, and Henry praises him for not marrying another actress, when, of course, Henry is doing that himself.
Yes.
While Henry's on the phone to Max and would like to get off the phone because Annie's headed off to bed, the bedroom light shining through the open door, his invitation to join her, and the Monkees' "I'm a Believer" comes up nice and loud and signals, I guess, that Henry does still believe. And he says to Max at some point, "Isn't love wonderful?" And I thought, is this a very romantic, sentimental ending, Mark?
No, like everything else in this play, it's very complex. So the most controversial line in the play in 1982, and it still is to a lot of people, and it's why some people don't like the play and don't like Stoppard on left-wing political grounds, is that Stoppard's most provocative argument is that public postures have the configuration of private derangements. So what he argues, Henry, is that anything we believe is not real, that we are conservative because of something that has happened to us, or the old Freudian thing that we are liberal because our parents were conservative, and so on. That's all there. But in a quite stunning way, to me, Annie then describes what really happened when she met Private Brody. And he didn't even know that there was an anti-nuclear weapons protest. He was in love with Annie, who he'd seen on Rosie of the Royal Infirmary, which he'd watched as a child. And to impress her, he got out his lighter and he set fire to the wreath on the cenotaph. But then there's a really remarkable line, I think. She says, "He would have done anything for me. He was my recruit." And Henry says, "I wish you'd told me that earlier. I could have written that." And I think that's a fantastic line.
Because it was about love.
Yeah, so he could understand someone being bewitched by Annie because he was. And actually, he's seen it all as a political story before, and it really isn't. But anyway, it's sometimes useful to speculate what happens to characters after the final scene of a play. I have absolutely no doubt. And I think Stoppard has said that he wants them to be happy. He wants them to stay together, Henry and Annie, and that's his intention. But I personally have absolutely no doubt that he writes the play for her and he writes his love play.
And the real thing is his love play?
Well, I think so, although it appears in the West End and she's in it and then she runs off with somebody else. But I think we are supposed to believe that that's what happens.
Well, I agree with you in the sense, and this is the romantic in me, because I think, and you talked about it before, the arc that Henry and Annie go through. They've been through a cycle from this passion of the beginning through the temptations, the mess, the abject pain of betrayal or adultery, to a place perhaps of equilibrium. As Henry says to his daughter, happiness is equilibrium. You also mentioned that it was about self-knowledge through pain, and he's been through the pain. He's more self-aware. He will be more attentive if he wasn't previously, if that's one of the suggestions. And then one thinks that now in the future he won't leave the door open out of carelessness, as he described.
And that he can write his play.
Yeah. And also, I love the idea of the real thing requires good balance between a couple in writing, in the weight and construction of a cricket bat, or in the form of a play. So I also agree that he has been through this process. There was a certain smugness, but he's learned something.
Yeah, he has.
We were talking about whether the play was dated or not in any way, other than references to Japanese digital watches and cruise missiles and things. What do you think?
It's complicated. I think thematically it hasn't dated at all because I think questions of authenticity in love, politics, and literature are, if anything, more current now than in 1982. However, the question of what you can say about whom and who can say it in theatre is a huge issue. And this, I think, is an interesting case because of the layers of complexity that we've mentioned. But in the 1986 text, which is the one recommended for production by Stoppard, in that opening scene, which we find out is from House of Cards, a not very good West End play, the husband discovers that his wife never went to Amsterdam when she said she went to Amsterdam because she was probably having an affair. And he says, I must say, I take my hat off to you coming home with Rembrandt placemats for your mother. It's those little touches that lift adultery out of the moral arena and make it a matter of style. One of the great lines, I think.
Yes.
But then, this is where it gets problematic for many people, it seems. The husband then says, Rembrandt placemats. I wonder who's got the originals. Some Arab, is it? Put the Rembrandts round Abdul and tell the kids to wash their hands. It's shoulder of goat. Now, until recently, that was regarded as okay. Interestingly, in the version currently at the Old Vic, it has been rewritten by Stoppard. Rembrandt placemats, I wonder who's got the originals. Put the Rembrandts round and tell the kids to wash their hands. So what's interesting about that is that I'm slightly surprised Stoppard agreed to it because it's not supposed to be a very good play, the first scene, House of Cards. And I think it'd be quite interesting if it still had those lines in, because that could be one of the reasons that Debbie doesn't like the play. But nobody would dare risk the audience thinking that's Stoppard being anti-Arab. But it's a very Stoppardian joke.
I love the idea of the originals.
But what it shows you, which is why I thought it was interesting to point this out, is the level of panic on the question of what audiences will tolerate or understand.
Well, also interesting that talk about the dating, because the Guardian critic, Arifa Akbar, wrote that she thought it certainly feels dated in its sexual dynamics in her review of the Old Vic production. And I wondered what she was referring to there. I mean, we've talked about the role of Annie, but there are some other slightly crude references to Debbie getting it on with the groom in the stables, or there's a line about rape somewhere.
Yes, so that's what I think Arifa is talking about, that the other cut that has been made, and I think it's impossible to argue against this one, is that there's a 10-line sequence early in their marriage, and I paraphrase some of this. Annie says to Henry, ooh, first time on our honeymoon that we haven't had sex last night. And he says, no, no, you were asleep, but I did it anyway. And she says, you didn't? And he says, yeah, I did.
I mean, it's supposed to be a joke. He says it as a joke. Maybe a tasteless one, but
Well, no, because you see, I looked at this. He first says, I'm joking. And then she says, are you really joking? And he says, no, 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 I did. And so it gets quite tricky. I share the horror of younger listeners that that wasn't a crime at the time, so-called marital rape. But if Henry had done that, he would now go to jail in the UK. And therefore, I think it does have to be cut.
okay, yes.
As in almost every line in this play, it's open to interpretation.
Yeah, was it real?
Yeah, was it real? So what he does is, I'm joking. She says, you are really joking, aren't you? And he says, no. So it's that game, which goes back to the Greeks, doesn't it? But to play that game in this context could be seen as a problem.
Yeah, okay. Mark, thank you so much. It's been, as you say, an incredibly rich play. But before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play, one that we might do on the podcast, but mainly that's just a personal favorite. So, with your obsessions with theater and seeing a lot, I know this is a terrible question to ask you, but is there a play you could recommend to our listeners that you absolutely love?
There is, and I think they'll know it. But curious enough, when I first met you at a theatre and you talked about coming on this, I said it would probably either be Stoppard or Ibsen. So Henrik Ibsen is an obsession of mine. And I've written about politics for 40 years or so. And I think that An Enemy of the People by Henrik Ibsen is probably one of the greatest and most relevant plays about politics ever written. I think people misunderstand it now because Ibsen's point is the majority can be wrong.
Yes.
Now, there are people who go to it and say, well, I'm in the majority and I'm not wrong, but that's the point. You can be in the majority and still be wrong.
Democracy can get it wrong.
Exactly, which is the point. He dares to question democracy. It also has a very special place in cultural history. Jaws by Peter Benchley, the novel and then the movie, are consciously and deliberately based on An Enemy of the People by Henrik Ibsen. Peter Benchley confirmed this, that when he sat down to write Jaws, he thought of two favourite works of his. One was Ibsen's Enemy of the People, the other one was Moby Dick, and he effectively put them together. But if you don't believe me, in An Enemy of the People, the central character has found something nasty in the water. It happens that it's bacillus or virus that is in the local spa baths. And the central character, Thomas Stockmann, who's the medical officer, he wants to close the baths. This puts him at odds with the local mayor. And Jaws is effectively the same plot, which is that there is something really nasty in the water. And the mayor has to decide whether to close down the lucrative resort attraction. So it is the same story. It's also the origin of the whistleblower thriller. All of them essentially are based on An Enemy of the People. And so it's a remarkable piece of work, and I recommend it to anyone.
Great choice. In fact, we did cover it on the podcast, and I'd missed that connection to Jaws. So Ibsen is another one of your obsessions. So when we next come up with another Ibsen play, I'll come back to you, Mark.
You should. Thank you very much, Doug.
Thank you. It's great to see you. Before we bring the curtain down, just a reminder that The Real Thing continues at the Old Vic Theatre until the 26th of October. Go and test your heart out. When the curtain falls, what endures is Stoppard's dazzling, refined skill as a dramatist, and his romantic vision of the power of love at its most sublime as it flares and shines and then settles to a more sustainable glow, of the power of language to lift the heart and fizz the mind, and of music to wordlessly overwhelm us. I may also be a last romantic, but for me, they all feel like the real thing. I'm a believer. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.